Let me welcome everybody to the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, where today we're going to be discussing Hamas. Is it changing? If so, are the changes significant for Palestinians, for Israelis, for the Middle East? My name is Cliff May. I'm FDD's president. Before we get started, let me ask everybody, if you've got cell phones, put them on vibrate if you can, or turn them off. This briefing is part of a series here at FDD where we bring together experts for productive, thoughtful, and for the most part, civil conversations about pressing national security and foreign policy issues. We're privileged to have with us today a number of people from the diplomatic corps, representatives from the U.S. government, think tanks, and others from the policy community. We welcome several members of the press, and this is an on-the-record session. As some of you have heard me say before, just in case you don't know, FDD, I do just want to mention this. FDD, our mission begins with principles. We focus on policies, and we hope to achieve progress. Those affiliated with FDD come from a pretty wide range of backgrounds. By no means do we agree on everything. We do agree on a few general principles. I'll mention three. One is that no one should be denied human rights, including freedom of religion, freedom of speech and assembly. No one should be discriminated against on the basis of gender or race or creed or color or sexual orientation. We believe that free and democratic nations have a right to defend themselves and an obligation to defend one another. And we believe that terrorism, which we define as the deliberate use of violence against civilians to achieve political objectives, is always wrong and under no circumstances should be condoned. Again, today we're looking at Hamas, and we're asking what's new. Hamas is reportedly strapped for cash, as its longtime patron Iran is finally feeling the effects of tightening international sanctions. Hamas's leadership, or its external leadership at least, is looking for a new home, new headquarters, as the situation in Syria has become untenable, with Iran supporting the Assad dynasty and the Muslim Brotherhood supporting the anti-Assad resistance. It's reported also that Hamas Prime Minister Ismail Haniyeh has been in Iran, where he once again ruled out any compromise with Israel, saying, quote, "The gun is our only response to the Zionist regime." Last week, the newspaper Al-Quds reported that high-level officials in Qatar and Bahrain and Kuwait had all advised Haniyeh not to go to Iran. And earlier this month, Hamas signed a reconciliation agreement with its longtime rival Fatah to create an interim unity government, but disagreements within Hamas apparently are responsible for stalling implementation of that agreement. So, what does all this mean? Are we looking at threats or opportunities? Is there a possibility to resuscitate the peace process, or is that peace process as dead as Monty Python's parrot? Our panel this morning includes three experts in Palestinian politics. Nathan Brown is a non-resident senior associate in the Middle East program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He focuses on Islamist movements, Palestinian politics, and Arab law and constitutionalism. Hussein Ibish is a senior research fellow at the American Task Force on Palestine and author of the book, What's Wrong with the One-State Agenda? Why Ending the Occupation and Peace with Israel is Still the Palestinian National Goal. And Jonathan Schwartz is vice president for research here at FDD. He's the author of the widely praised and cited book, Hamas versus Fatah. What did I say?
Schwartz, but that's
I said Schwartz. I got to get it. Jonathan Schanzer here.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. What a pleasure. It's good to see you. There you go. Hamas versus Fatah, the struggle for Palestine, which analyzes the internecine conflict between the two most powerful Palestinian factions. Jonathan Schwartz, by the way, was he was a radio DJ in New York when I was growing up. Do anybody remember him? He was really terrific. He did old Frank Sinatra and American standards. I listen to every Sunday. Listen to the Jonathan Schwartz show.
I am not a DJ, just for the record.
Just for the record. It was a wonderful radio show. And I'm sure that's what popped in mind. When you get old, this happens. Anyway. I've asked everyone to open up with some brief remarks, provocative remarks, I hope, and then we'll move to questions and conversation. And so, Nathan, if you don't mind, we'll start with you.
Okay, thank you very much. I do have the affiliation at Carnegie. My main affiliation is actually with George Washington University, and I mention that because I feel right at home right now. It looks just like a university classroom. Nobody will ever sit in the front row. They're afraid of getting called on. So don't worry, you can sit back.
And you're not a hard marker, I understand.
No.
Is it going to be a pop quiz?
I won't administer it. I like to start an event like this talking about actually sometimes what I don't know. That would probably take up all of my time. So let me start with sort of the sorts of things that I do know. That is how it is that I approach the question of Hamas. And I study Hamas primarily from the public record. That is what they say. Now, in Hamas's case, this is a movement that is incredibly loquacious. It just won't shut up. So that's not all that hard. And increasingly, some of its internal deliberations are reflected in public discourse. They are arguing with each other, not simply in closed settings, but also increasingly through the press. But I thought, and the other avenue by which I study them is essentially as a Muslim Brotherhood movement. I mean, it's essentially in comparative perspective. There's some distinctive features about Hamas, which I hope to mention very briefly. But in that regard, I'm going to start with two personal stories that I think illustrate something about Muslim Brotherhood movements in politics, and especially Hamas. The first personal story has nothing to do with Hamas. It has to do with my great uncle, who was a member of the Indiana Communist Party in the 1930s. Now, why is this relevant? Well, something interesting happened to my great uncle. He was purged from the party for ideological offenses. That means his two friends kicked him out. This is how highly ideological movements police themselves. I mean, whether it's the Catholic Church, whether it's the whether it's movements of ideological movements of the left. I'm not sure either one would appreciate the analogy, but Muslim Brotherhood movements are different. They argue all the time. Actual schisms are extremely rare, and I want to explore a little bit why. And for that reason, let me bring you to the second story. About a year ago, I was sitting in the living room of a prominent Hamas leader in the West Bank, and I'd made an appointment to see him primarily because somebody had told me, "You've got to talk to this guy. He is capable of giving ideological justification for acceptance of a two-state solution." So I'm sitting in his living room, and his son is sitting next to him, and I sort of talk about a bunch of different topics, and then finally I talk about sort of Hamas's strategic visit, and he said, "No problem, Islamic State and all of Palestine." And I'm beginning to think at this point, I'm glad I'm a university professor, not a professional peace processor, because this is not a great negotiating position to start with. But he goes on about the beauties of an Islamic State. Everybody will live equally, blah, 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 blah. And his son listens to all this. He says, "What my father is saying is absolutely correct from a religious point of view. However, from a political point of view, Hamas accepts a state on the 67 borders." And then father and son look at each other, and they both smile and nod approvingly. So what's Hamas? And the answer is yes. In a sense, this is typical. Muslim Brotherhood movements take their ideologies very, very seriously, but they tend to be extremely broad and very, very plastic. These are organizations that describe themselves as very practical, very engaged, and really kind of worried about sort of taking some sort of general principles and applying them tomorrow. So you can have Muslim people. Getting back to my great uncle, you do not get kicked out of the Muslim Brotherhood for anything that you say or anything that you think. You can get kicked out for something that you do if you violate movement discipline, if they say don't do this and you do it anyway. But so what you have are these movements that are, in a sense, very practical, very engaged, and very, very plastic. What does that mean right now for Hamas? Hamas is an organization that is a little bit like the Muslim Brotherhood organization. I mean, it bases itself on one and calls itself a Muslim Brotherhood organization. The strains within the organization are probably a little bit bigger because they're trying to do more things than most Muslim Brotherhood organizations do. They're trying to be a government in Gaza. They're trying to be a resistance movement. They're trying to play international diplomacy. They're trying to, basically be sort of a quasi-state actor at the international level. They're trying to do all of these things at the same time. So they have a more ambitious agenda, and they're geographically more spread out, and they don't have the same kind of hierarchical structure they do have decision-making structures, but power at the top of the organization is a little bit more diffuse in other organizations. So what that means is that they can sometimes go in several directions at the same time. I do not expect that to lead to a formal split or rupture in the organization, but for really one of the first times, not the first time, but one of the first times we're seeing those differences on public view. The last time that I saw a difference this much in public view was after the Mecca Agreement in 2007, when there was an agreement to form a national unity government. And Mahmoud Zahar, the foreign minister in the outgoing government, stood up on the floor of the Palestinian parliament and denounced the agreement that his movement had just signed, and said essentially, you are now, don't you realize what you're doing? You're embarking on a process which you cannot control. And then he sat down, and when the new government was presented in pursuant to the Mecca Accord, he voted for it. Party discipline. So something that he had attacked, he sort of swung behind. Right now, for Hamas, what its situation, and if you're a practically minded member of Hamas or leader of Hamas, kind of the situation right now looks, in some ways it has an awful lot of threats. I mean, what's happening in Syria, financial problems and so on, but it's also a moment of incredible opportunity, and most of the Hamas's leaders tend to be cheery and optimistic people about their own organization. This is a movement this is a time in which American power in the region is declining, in which the Islamist trend is rising within the region, and if Hamas can kind of get through this kind of period, it could be in a very different and much more admirable situation. That's how it looks, especially from the perspective of those people, I think, who are internationally minded. So they're pushing the organization in ways to take advantage of those regional opportunities. The government in Gaza obviously has not simply international diplomacy to worry about, but over 1 million people to govern. And it also is, governing it things very, very well, thank you. So the combination of threats and opportunities are, in a sense, similar, but they're weighed very, very differently depending on where you sit within the organization. And as a result, I think you're going to see a continuation of the current pattern, where different leaders in Hamas will be pulling it in different directions, finding out how far they can push the organization without actually getting to the point of breaking movement discipline. I mean, they're getting right up to the edge right now, but my guess is that they will pull back. Final word in conclusion: how will we know if Hamas has actually changed? That is to say, if, for instance, the people who are trying to integrate it as a normal diplomatic and political actor do succeed, and they certainly haven't yet by any means. I think in some ways they're on the defensive. We won't know if they succeeded by the issuing of any kind of ideological document. Right? Ideology changes later. They do what they want to do, and then they figure out why it was Islamic later. But there will be two things, I think, to watch for, and both, I think, are possible but unlikely. First, if elections actually come off. That would be a real institutional test, and it would force Hamas to reconfigure its orientation towards Palestinian public opinion, which they haven't really had to worry about since the Palestinian split of 2007. And second, a real willingness to allow, when Abu Mazen or people who report to him dutifully show up when the Americans call negotiations that nobody believes in at this point anymore, but when they do show up, Hamas has actually been very, very critical of that, saying, wait a second, we're supposed to have some consensual decision-making structure, we didn't agree to that. If Hamas begins to drop its objections, in essence, if it begins to say the leadership is free to negotiate, we may not agree with what they're negotiating, but that is our leadership. If they begin to talk that kind of language, that will be the kind of significant step. Hamas is not going to open peace negotiations with Israel. Israel is not asking it to open negotiations. That is not going to happen. But if they give some signal that they will allow negotiations to go forward, negotiations that probably will not produce anything, but if they allow that, that to me would be a very significant step on the part of the organization that would be worth paying attention to.
Thank you. Hussein.
Thank you. A great introduction from Professor Brown there. So the question is Hamas changing, right? And the answer is yes, but as little as humanly possible. That's, I think, the one-line answer. And there are three reasons why Hamas has an incentive both to change but to keep those changes to an absolute minimum. The incentive to change is the new regional environment, which I'll describe, and I'll describe its effect on Hamas and this split, which I think is a lot more severe than the one in following the Mecca Agreement in 2007, or the most severe I've seen in living memory. But also, the reasons for the three reasons for wanting to keep those changes to a minimum. Let me start with those. The first is their ideology. This is an organization. You're right. They make pragmatic decisions, like all political groups, and then they justify them later. But they are founded on a categorical and absolutist a reading of reality. You go back to their original documents and also their core ideology. It's pretty categorical and pretty absolutist, and it's hard to justify adapting that kind of ideology to those people in your movement who are drawn to it by its categorical nature, by its absolutism, by its unswervingness. So if you're, in other words, if you're a group which has a fairly extreme ideology, and they are, it's hard to adjust without alienating some people who are drawn to you for that reason, and for that reason you would want to keep that to a minimum. The second reason they would want to keep change to a minimum is their rivalry with the PLO and the PA, and with Abu Mazen. They have been locked in a contest for national leadership with the PLO and the PA since the death of Arafat. Since the death of Arafat, they emerged as a plausible candidate for the national leadership of the Palestinians, and that contest is not yet decided. Right? One party eventually is going to prevail, or both will fail, possibly, and a third thing emerge. But any kind of serious national reconciliation would have to be on one party's terms or another. You can't fit the square peg of Hamas's rhetoric about never recognizing Israel and armed resistance and whatnot with the round hole of the PLO's strategy of negotiating a two-state solution with Israel and institution building on the ground. So one of these things has to give in order for the two things to fit together. I think, at least in terms of domestic political appeal, it's pretty clear that Hamas's hard line against Israel, which has been facilitated by its alliance with Syria and Iran, has been a competitive advantage, or at least a competitive leverage against the PLO. They have outbid the PLO at every stage on national issues, and they say, so these guys are collaborators, sellouts, cop-outs, weak, corrupt, whatever. We are the real nationalists. We are the really strong. We confront Israel. That sort of thing. So insofar as you move away from that, you're giving up what is, especially when there isn't any movement on peace, and there isn't right now, and there isn't going to be in the foreseeable future, you're giving up something that can be a relative competitive advantage in Palestinian politics, and it's something that you would give up as little of as possible if you're really hoping to unseat the PA and the PLO as the national leadership. The third reason is that this adaptation that is going on is producing a very profound split within the leadership of the organization. Right? So beyond explaining changes to their core membership, and beyond their worrying about the rivalry with the PLO and the PA, they have to be a little bit concerned about the bitter public feud that has emerged. And this feud is not reflective of personalities. It's reflective of divergent interests between the internal and the external leadership, or most of both of those, that have emerged over the past year in the context of the Arab uprisings. And this is really crucial to understand. This isn't an ideological argument, or an argument over personalities and factions with interests and sort of and a patronage and parochial thing. This is about divergent interests, and I'll explain why. Now, under such circumstances, you have to be very, very concerned about how far this can go. Now, I completely agree with Professor Brown. I don't expect a schism in the movement. I don't think Hamas is going to split into two parts or anything like that. But when you have this sort of bitter, angry public dispute, it's reflective of an organization in crisis. Okay, and that's what Hamas is. Hamas is an organization in crisis, and that's not a good thing. And the more the external leadership or others try to adapt to the new regional strategic realities by changing, the more the crisis is likely to grow until it's, again, resolved. As I say, I think one perspective will prevail and discipline will be maintained ultimately, but there's a struggle. There's a power struggle in the organization right now, and it's in the open. It's not behind closed doors. So what has happened regionally? Well, the Arab uprisings have produced two effects that have made life made business as usual for Hamas impossible. And the first is that the entire region has become split, not within any given country necessarily, although in places like Syria and Bahrain that is obviously the case, but regionally very split along sectarian lines in quite a stark way, with generally tending to pit Sunnis versus everybody else to some extent. And you can see this in the rise in influence of Turkey, the decline of influence of Iran, and everybody having to make these choices in terms of Syria, where every single Sunni government and Islamist movement is opposed to al-Assad now, and all of his supporters are non-Sunnis. They're either Shiites or Christians, whether Lebanese or Syrian, or Shiites from around the Middle East. So this, and the mirror image is in Bahrain, where the opposition is almost entirely supported by their fellow Shiites in the region, and the government is either wholeheartedly or lukewarmly supported by virtually all Sunni, not just governments, but Islamist groups as well. So there's this very stark sectarian split regionally, and it's not a done deal, it's not secured, it's not solidified, but this is very strongly the trend. Now, this has made Hamas's branding and regional strategic profile unsustainable from the past 10 years. Unsustainable. The sort of counter-hegemonic narrative in the Arab political discourse over the past 10 years was the idea that there was a trans-historical or historical anyway battle going on in the Arab political soul between the axis of resistance on the one hand and the axis of accommodation on the other, sometimes called the culture of resistance and the culture of accommodation. And in this narrative, the Islamist groups, especially the Muslim Brothers or other Sunni Islamists, were counted in the axis of resistance, but also the Iranian alliance, including Iran, Syria, Hezbollah, etc., were all included in this idea of the axis of resistance. And the axis of accommodation or moderation or whatever was most of the Arab governments, with the exception of Syria and maybe sometimes Qatar. The corollary was that the resistance forces should defeat the accommodationists, and then all will be well. And this was really the dominant opposition narrative in the Arab world over the past 10 years. Now, what's fascinating is that the Arab uprisings didn't reflect that narrative at all, in spite of the fact that the weight of Al Jazeera was behind it, the weight of some of the big newspapers was behind it. It didn't. That's not the narrative that took hold in Tunisia and Tahrir Square, and even in the Syrian uprising, etc., at all. And I think that the space for these trans-sectarian alliances has broken down. The notion that you can be, as Hamas was positioned as, both a core Muslim Brotherhood party, part of the Sunni Arab Islamist movements, and at the same time a key member of the Iranian alliance, which is effectively a Shiite alliance involving Iran, Syria, the Alawite regime in Syria, Hezbollah, some groups in the Gulf, etc. Those days are over. That is shattered. The mythology of the axis of resistance is gone. You cannot brand yourself anymore as a Sunni Islamist group that is a core ally of Iran at the same time. Now this is an oxymoron. Okay. It came to a head in late March, early April in Syria, where Hamas had been headquartered. Okay. Politburo, external leadership, had been headquartered. And as Cliff said, when the Muslim Brotherhood of Syria emerged as a core constituency of the uprising, and it has been, since it was founded, probably the single most influential organization within the Syrian National Council, not its public face, not its key political leadership, which tends to be liberal and seculars, Burhan Ghalioun and Basma Kudmani, but behind that, the Muslim Brothers are enormously influential and getting closer than ever to Turkey and whatnot. It really was impossible. Hamas had to choose, and they could not have chosen to stick with Assad and to stick with Tehran and to stick with their old image. The external leadership had to choose their Sunni Islamist identity. It wasn't an option. So they had to relocate from Syria. The last leader left 3 weeks ago. There's nobody senior in Hamas left in Damascus, and they won't be going back anytime in the future. So the external leadership now has not only an identity crisis and a branding crisis. They need new headquarters. They need new patrons. They need a new regional strategic profile. They need a new identity politically in the region. They cannot be what they were before. So they have to redefine themselves, which is why Khalid Mashal, the head of the Politburo, has been traveling to Jordan, a country he's a citizen of but hadn't formally been to since the late 90s, courting them, to Egypt many times, courting both the SCAF and the Muslim Brothers and anyone else who will listen to him in Egypt, to Qatar, where he's clearly made a lot of progress with the Emir, to other Gulf states, etc., trying to find a way to reintegrate Hamas into the Arab fold, away from Iran, I think clearly, in a way that keeps the cost down. Now, here's the problem within the Hamas leadership, is that the leadership in Gaza doesn't really participate in this crisis, or at least not nearly as much. They're sitting there, they have this massive smuggling network which produces a great deal of income, they have other sources of income, they've got all the guns, they get harassed by armed gangs like Islamic Jihad and some of the Salafist jihadist groups that are even crazier than Islamic Jihad, and fine. But their rule is unchallenged in Gaza. So they don't have this same crisis. And from their perspective, I think a lot of them, I'm not saying all, I'm not saying either of these camps are united. This is a little bit reductive, but from the Gazan point of view, I think the external leadership is running around making momentous decisions at their political expense and ratcheting up an enormous political bill on their credit card. And they're angry about it. They argue, as both Cliff and Professor Brown suggested, that in the long run, there's a strong likelihood, I don't agree with this, I think this is wishful thinking, but they argue that there's a strong likelihood that their fellow Muslim brothers will come to uncontested power, absolute power in countries like Egypt and elsewhere, and that there's no need to compromise with Abbas or Qatar or anybody at the moment, and all they have to do is sit tight and sit pretty, and the power and dominance, say, of the Palestinian national movement will fall like a ripe fruit into their hands, because the Arab Spring will turn into an Islamic awakening or some other ideological fantasy. This is what they argue, and it's not unthinkable, it's just unlikely. Well, the external leadership can't wait. They don't have that luxury. They can't make that gamble because they need to adjust, as I've said. And this has produced this enormous backlash against the agreement with Abbas. Immediately it was signed, the Hamas bloc in parliament in Gaza issued a legal memorandum. It was about 5 or 6 pages long, listing point after point in Palestinian law and declaring the whole thing illegal. Zahar, obviously speaking not just for himself but on behalf of others as well, called the agreement, well, he said no one had been consulted, first of all, very bitterly, and he called it a mistake that couldn't be implemented and a real crisis. And the most recent thing is not just that Haniyeh went to Iran to see if he could shore up the relationship, which is, and the Gulf states told him not to go because, as I say, all of this is reflective of this regional divide. But I mean, there is, just a quick aside, there is some basis for the Gazan leadership to hope that Iran wouldn't necessarily cut them off for 2 reasons. First, to sabotage this Gulf Arab brokered Palestinian deal. I mean, the Iranians would have an interest in making this not work, just to bedevil their enemies, for one thing. Secondly, they might want to retain Hamas after all. Even, I think, a few months ago, if you'd asked them, do you really want to keep Hamas on your payroll and in your camp, I think the answer would be, hell no. Look what they're doing to our, bestest buddy, Bashar. This is unacceptable, and they've got to go. I think now that the rhetoric about a potential Israeli or American attack on their nuclear facilities has, increased, and if they're thinking in those terms, they might consider that continuing to pay Hamas in Gaza is useful not only to mess with Gulf plans and Egyptian plans and other plans, but also perhaps to give at least the impression that they have another chit, as well as Hezbollah and others, in the event of being attacked. So it's not impossible. But apparently there's a great deal of Qatari money at stake. And I think if the Gulf states were really to invest in this, a significant opportunity to end, for all practical purposes, the Iranian-Hamas alliance, which is already in very, very bad shape. Now, the last thing that's happened is that Haniyeh and Mishal, the de facto prime minister of Gaza and the leader of the Politburo, met in Qatar, and they were unable to resolve their differences. So the question ultimately is, how far does Hamas change? Does it become a force for peace? Does it accept the quartet principles? Does it become a legitimate international actor in the eyes of the West, Israel, etc.? My answer to that is not if they can help it. For the reasons that I mentioned, they're going to try to keep the price as low as possible. But being aligned, if the external leadership can secure things so that Hamas, generally speaking, is aligned with Qatar, Jordan, Egypt, and states like that, they will have to behave very differently than being a client primarily of Tehran and Damascus. That's as simple as that. Whatever they say, they cannot behave the way they have. And so, again, I say they will try to keep the price to a minimum, but at least the external leadership, which has had political primacy and still, it seems, the Qassam brigades, the paramilitary wing, still defers to them. It's not absolutely clear where they fall down on this dispute, but until now they've deferred to their ultimate leadership. Is going to have to make this organization adapt because the real world is pressing down on them hard.
Thank you. Jonathan.
Okay. Thank you both for coming. Nathan, your work on this subject, is Hamas mellowing, was the inspiration for our discussion today, and for anyone who reads Hussein's work, he's put out a couple of terrific pieces in Now Lebanon on this issue. So I think we've got a terrific panel to address this topic today. I'm going to, I think, rehash a little bit of what you've heard already, but hopefully put a different spin on it. With perhaps some additional details. First of all, I think it's worth noting that Hamas was formed as a splinter from the Muslim Brotherhood, and it has splintered once already, internal versus external, and I think it's quite possible that we'll see additional splinters. I'm not saying that you're looking at a complete fracturing of the organization, but as in any organization anywhere, Middle East or anywhere around the world, you're going to see differences of opinion within the leadership, and I think that one should expect this and not try to read too deeply into anything. I mean, this is the way organizations are run. But I do think we are seeing some profound differences, I think, as Hussein just mentioned, between the internal and external leadership. I think we are seeing a crisis on the part of the external and not so much of a crisis on the part of the internal, and I think that is extremely significant. On the internal side, it's interesting. Traditionally, the internal leadership was the more sort of timid of the two. It was, I think, largely due to the fact that it had overtaken the Gaza Strip in 2007. It began to assume responsibilities of a government, and so challenging the Israelis openly, especially after the CAS-led operation of 2008-2009, there was a fear factor in terms of embracing too much of a hard line, in terms of challenging the Israelis too much. There was a sense that they could suffer as the result of yet another Israeli incursion, and I think to a certain extent deterrence had sort of taken hold. The Israelis had kind of established that there were parameters where the internal leadership could operate, and there were red lines that they couldn't pass. That's not to say that there wouldn't be risk-taking on the part of the internal leadership, but generally speaking, I would argue that it was sort of hemmed in. And then you've got, on the other side, you've got the external leadership. This is the traditionally more brash side of Hamas. These are the people who were trained and armed and financed and given guidance by Iran and by Syria, the so-called Iranian axis, and that this was the source for the majority of the radicalism, if you will, coming out of Hamas in recent years. But of course, as we've heard now, the external leadership is now looking for a new home. And as a result, we continue to hear that the external leadership is thinking about mellowing or moderating or changing in some way. I think what Hussein just said, I think rings very true to me, that when you look at where the external leadership is thinking about going for new sponsorship, I think it's very unlikely that the external leadership would be able to maintain its current level of radicalization. I think it's very true. I mean, you look at Jordan. Obviously everyone's been talking about whether a new headquarters can be established there. I can tell you that that's, from my perspective, there's zero chance of that happening. The Hashemite regime, I think, needs to have some outreach to Hamas in some way to reach out to, this is actually, you have to look at this in terms of the domestic issues that are taking place in Jordan. They need to kowtow to the Islamic Action Front, which is the Muslim Brotherhood branch in Jordan, which is, I think, threatening the stability of the regime, at least on some level. And so they need to show that they're working with the Palestinian faction of the Muslim Brotherhood. Qatar would certainly, even though I think we all know that there is a great deal of funding coming from Qatar, I don't believe for a second that the Qataris would allow Hamas to have a base there, and I don't think that they would openly embrace Hamas's positions, just simply due to the fact that there's a huge amount of American investment, military investment in that country, and this is ultimately what safeguards Qatar. The Al Udeid base is critical for the survival of Qatar, especially at this dangerous moment. And then with Egypt, Egypt is certainly at this point not in a position to take on Hamas in any significant way. And so if Hamas did ultimately go in either one of these directions, it would have to moderate. And so that's good news, I think, if you're trying to figure out whether the external leadership will dial back. And then I also think that it's important to look at this unity deal that's taking place, or may take place, or at least that's causing problems within the Palestinians right now. It's important to look at it from the perspective of the external leadership. I mean, they're the ones who are driving this, and for them, it's an insurance policy. If they want to go back to the territories, they need to have this in place. It is cover for them in order to be able to function in Palestinian society. It is, after all, the external leadership that ultimately, I think, precipitated what led to the coup of 2007. But all that said, I don't believe that the external leadership is going to be out of the clutches of the Iranian axis. Iran has, at least at this point, really no ability to impact the external leadership from, I'll use a psychology term, from positive reinforcement, right? They're not able to provide the funds that they once were able to provide, $300 to $500 or $600 million, whatever the amount is. And obviously, Hamas is not going to Ernst & Young, so we don't know what the exact budget is. But we know that it's been a significant amount of cash, and we also know that financial sanctions, which continue to be ratcheted up, we know that this is going to impact Iran's ability to pay off Hamas, to be able to get them to do what they want them to do, the traditional sort of patron-client relationship that has been established over time. But what they can do is they can impact Hamas in a negative way. And actually so can Syria to a certain extent. Hamas is heavily invested in Iran and Syria, personally. I mean, they have their holdings in these countries. And these countries do not abide by the same financial standards that, for example, we do here. I mean, you can have asset freezes. You can hold things over the Hamas organization. And actually, even beyond that, and we know that every one of the external leaders have invested heavily in Syria. They have property there. They've got accounts there. And so extricating themselves completely from the clutches of this axis, I think, is at this point virtually impossible. But then the other thing that I think is also important to know, and I think Hussein alluded to this briefly, is that the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, PIJ, can create huge problems for Hamas. Hamas sees itself as the government in Gaza, and so PIJ can play the role of the spoiler, and PIJ is bought and paid for by Iran, and so Iran can create major havoc for Hamas if it doesn't play ball or continue to play ball in some way with the regime. And so what we're seeing right now is an external leadership that is open to pragmatism, but is by no means by no means certain that they are going to be pragmatic. There are still many hurdles that they are going to have to pass. And and we still don't know. For example, I mean, with Turkey, if Turkey were to become the patron, I mean, Turkey continues to sort of take a slide towards Islamism, but it certainly is not in a place where it's willing to take on an open and avowed terrorist organization inside its territory. It's not in that place. But if we continue to see a slide, Perhaps. I mean, we've actually been hearing for a long time about whether Turkey is going to become the new sponsor of Hamas. There were reports back in December that there were $300 million that the Turks had pledged. Obviously, they denied it, Hamas denied it, but that doesn't mean that it's not happening. So, so you've got this potential pragmatism on the part of the external leadership. And then at the same time, I would argue that the internal leadership, as Hussein has already indicated, is hardening. They don't want to cede power to the PLO. They are the ones who are standing against this right now in a very, in a very forceful way. And they also understand that at home they will lose legitimacy if they renounce violence, if they renounce resistance. This is something that they're just simply unable to do. That said, there's still, the internal leadership is still hemmed in. There are parameters where, so what you're looking at is an organization that says it's committed to violence, but isn't necessarily willing to carry out attacks. And so I think that's where the differences are. Now, I think, it's obviously very difficult to make predictions in this part of the world. But I would argue that right now that the differences between the external and internal are very significant. And so I'll just game this out for a minute. First of all, I think, as Hussein says, there is a crisis within the external leadership. They are panicked. I mean, the reason why they're on this world tour is not to project power. It's not to show everybody that Hamas is accepted everywhere throughout the Arab Spring. It's because they are panicked, looking for a new home. They're looking for new finances. They're thinking about embracing the nonviolence of the Muslim Brotherhood after rejecting that 24 years ago. In other words, it's back to the future for them. I mean, this is a sign, to a certain extent, of capitulation on their part. They're thinking about joining forces with the PLO after 24 years of rejecting the PLO's approach to governance. This is significant. And now they're taking up homes and offices in places like Jordan or in Egypt. We know that Mashal is thinking about Jordan. We know that Marzouk has already gone back to Egypt. So literally they are all over the map. And so you're looking at an external leadership that was once the sort of backbone of the sort of jihadist tendencies. It's beginning to, it's been beginning to evaporate. But so, so while you have this going on, this weakening, again, the strengthening of the external, I think, is sort of, I mean, just to put a little bit of granularity on this, it's not in crisis. And it's not because of Hania, it's not because of Zahar. It's not because of any of the leaders' politics there. It's because the Gaza Strip is Hamas's base. It's their home. It's their headquarters. They're not interested in changing. And actually, I think the real bellwether for this are the mid-level cadres, the people who fought in the 2008-2009 war. These are the people who are in their 20s. They cut their teeth fighting the Israelis. They see themselves right now as defending Gaza, which is the beginning of the Islamization of the Palestinian territories. They're very proud of what they've now controlled. They see themselves as officials within a government, and they're not willing to cede that power. And I believe that ultimately this is the Hamas of the future. It is Gaza internal mid-level cadres. These are the people who will determine the direction of Hamas in the future, because I do believe with the externals evaporating, or at least seeming much less strong, at least for the short term, this is an opportunity for these mid-level cadres in Gaza to consolidate. So short term, we're seeing possible pragmatism within half of Hamas. Long term, we're looking at probably a hardening of the broader Hamas organization due to the fact that its base is exactly in that position. Now, just two other quick thoughts before I close. One, I think it's important to note throughout all of this that Hamas's calculations over the last X number of years have now proven to be miscalculations. The fact that Hamas decided to overrun the Gaza Strip, believing that it was strong enough to do that, and is now finding that it needs to kowtow in some way to the PLO to be able to find safety again. Obviously, that's a miscalculation. The miscalculation of aligning with Iran, the miscalculation of investing so heavily in Syria. I mean, no one would have been able to predict all the things that have been happening, but certainly what Hamas is finding is that its approach up until now, I think, we saw the real shift in Hamas in 2004 when the Saudis really began to, cut off the funding. They made this shift. They very, sort of openly joined this Iranian axis, and I think that ultimately those, these 7 years, we'll look back, and if we can take a look at the history of Hamas, these 7 years will look like an error. And I think that there's some taking stock that's happening right now. And then one other quick thought, and I don't even know the answer to this, but I think it's an important question to ask, is the policy that was put in place by the Bush administration in 2007 of sanctioning the Gaza Strip in the wake of the Civil War. Is that something that is contributing to what we're seeing now? The fact that Hamas is more isolated, the fact that the strictures around Gaza make it harder for travel, make it harder for foreign relations. Has this had an impact? And I don't know. But I'd actually be curious to hear what my fellow panelists have to say about whether that policy has ultimately led to the weakening of Hamas over time, or if it's actually strengthened that internal leadership that we're talking about that may become the backbone. And that's something that it's maybe a thought for an article, or at least for further discussion here today. I'll end there.